All right. So hello, I'm Roxanne Hendershot. I am an assistant principal in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Before I start, I do want to thank Dr. Letizia for all of his guidance and time. There was never a time where he was not available to answer my questions, meet with me. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Spratt and Dr. Spratt for their feedback on my writing and guidance on my research. So thank you very much. I didn't bring any guests, but my husband has been instrumental in supporting me through this work and listened to this presentation many times. So um, so today I will sort of outline my paper. I'll talk about my research question and why I chose that question, summarize the historiography, and briefly touch on the historical context in which my research takes place. And then I'll dig into my three primary chapters. One is just on the history of land use in Anne Arundel County after 1968. Then there are three case studies that I outline in my paper that kind of demonstrate how land use and zoning policies impacted school demographic patterns in the earliest stages of school desegregation and then in a more contemporary time in the 90s. And then I'll conclude with conclusions and further research. So this is, Dr. Letizia is correct. This is a study, or this is a topic that I've been interested in for a long time. I kind of came into the program knowing that this is what I would want to study. I've been living in Anne Arundel County now for 20 years, and it's apparent that there are some communities in the county that are very racially homogenous, and then there are other communities in the county that are very racially diverse. I've worked at three different schools in Anne Arundel County. Two of those schools were predominantly white, and the school that I'm at now is much more racially diverse, much more reflective of the county demographic data overall. So the question I wanted to answer was, why is this so? How did this get to this point? And what role did zoning, housing, residential zoning, and land use have on how these patterns emerged? So this historical study analyzed the role of land use and zoning policies on living patterns from 1965 to 2020 and traced patterns in residential zoning throughout Anne Arundel County, juxtaposing them over school demographic patterns throughout the second half of the 20th century. So the historiography that I did, I used a lot of studies that were really demographic studies. I looked at a lot of studies that were conducted by demographers, sociologists, and then historians. Specifically, there were several studies done on the suburbs around Detroit and several studies done throughout the South. There are a lot of themes that emerged from my historiography, one of which is that schools continue to be highly racially segregated, despite the fact that, Brown versus Board of Education passed the Supreme Court 70 years ago. And much of that segregation is based on living patterns, residential segregation. And much of the research speaks of current day segregation as de facto segregation, segregation not as a result of government policy, but as a result of choice or other factors outside of government policy. And what I sought to demonstrate in my study was that where people live is very much guided by policies made at the national, state, and local level. And this scholarship particularly was looking at how local government policy impacted living patterns and then consequently impacting school demographic patterns. So this study sought to fill a void in scholarship. While there was a lot of scholarship on urban development and development in southern the United States, there wasn't a lot on emerging suburbs, growing suburbs in the Mid-Atlantic. So I wanted to show that there was a relationship between government policy and continued school segregation at the local level. The documents and information that I used, I was able to get from the Anne Arundel County Office of Planning and Zoning. I was able to get copies of, they had the 1968, the first ever general development plan. They had that digitized. So I was able to get that. They had the 1978 plan digitized. The 1986 plan, they only had land use maps. They didn't have the whole plan, but this is a process that Anne Arundel County goes through every 10 to 12 years. So I had access to every plan up until 2010. So that is probably the biggest part of where my research came from, but I also used the desegregation file at the Maryland State Archives, which is a very significant file of documents, really documenting the history of Anne Arundel County Public Schools from the early 1900s through the mid to late 1960s. So I relied heavily on those documents. I relied on census data and school demographic data from the United States Census and Maryland Report Card, which is through Maryland State Department of Education. They collect and track school data. And then I also had access to just dozens and dozens of newspaper articles from the Baltimore Sun and the Annapolis Capital that I got from a variety of places. The Anne Arundel County Historical Society had a huge trove of documents. The Odenton Historical Society had a big trove of documents. And then just through my own research, a lot of this work is digitized. So those are the documentation, the historical documents that I used to do my research. The context of Anne Arundel County, most important is to note is for the first half of the 20th century, Anne Arundel County was very much a southern, sort of culturally southern place. It was agricultural. They grew tobacco. The economy was very much dependent on agriculture. It was once a slave holding district, and in the years prior to Brown versus Board of Education, it was a legally segregated place. World War II was a huge turning point in Anne Arundel County. After the war, Anne Arundel County experienced the same kind of trends that were happening at the national level. There was a baby boom, a huge population growth, also as a result of the growing importance of Fort Meade after World War II. And this tremendous population growth put strain on schools that they had to build schools and they had to build homes very, very quickly in order to accommodate this growing population. So in the 1950s, growth and development was kind of scattered, uneven, and unplanned. So by the time that the county incorporated into a charter government, the first thing the first county executive did was undergo a comprehensive zoning process to create a more planned community throughout Anne Arundel County. Importantly, when Brown versus Board of Education was passed, Anne Arundel County was very, very slow to begin their desegregation process. They did it solely on a freedom of choice basis, and very few schools attempted any kind of desegregation. So by 1966, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, when there was more pressure from the federal government to engage in desegregation, Anne Arundel County had a lot of work to do in a very short period of time. So chapter 3 really goes through each general development plan from 1968 all the way up to 2010. The most important takeaway that I discovered was prior to the general development process, communities in Anne Arundel County were already very racially segregated. Much of this had to do with there were some communities that had racial covenants built into their neighborhoods, and unfair lending practices and things like that just made it harder for African Americans to purchase homes. So the new subdivisions that were built like in the 50s and 60s prior to comprehensive zoning were already quite segregated. When the 1968 plan, before the plan was developed, they engaged in a 3 to 4 year long process, a deep study into current land use patterns and things in Anne Arundel County. And the pattern of development that emerged from the 1968 plan was very, very similar to the one that already existed. There were pockets of development in northern Anne Arundel County. There are pockets of development in western Anne Arundel County, and there were pockets of higher density development in Annapolis. Now, Annapolis is its own municipality, so they govern their own land use and zoning, but it is a densely populated region of Anne Arundel County. What I found from the 1968 plan to the 1978 plan, one thing that changed tremendously was people's attitude about population growth, development, and so forth. Whereas the 1968 plan was developed in the context of the civil rights movement, in the context of wanting to desegregate schools, there was some aspirational language in the 68 plan to encourage access to housing and to encourage building schools in areas where they could create a more racially balanced school district. However, by the 1978 plan, all of that language was gone and was really replaced by phrases like controlled development, contained development. And there was a clear picture of where they wanted development to go. And that was very much focused in northern Anne Arundel County and western Anne Arundel County, which is ultimately where the most racially diverse schools would end up. And then you had communities in southern Anne Arundel County and communities along the coastline, or what they called coastal communities, that seemed to be kind of protected from increased development and higher density development. So the patterns of school demographics that emerged in these regions of the county were very different. You have, and I have some visuals to show this in a few slides, but what you see is there were some schools that remained predominantly and overwhelmingly white because the neighborhoods and the communities that they served were predominantly and overwhelmingly white, whereas other schools became more and more racially diverse as school or as density patterns became more and more medium to high density, and with some multifamily density mixed in. And these images just show sort of the earliest, where you see the darker shading. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Up here in northern Anne Arundel County, this is where there were some already higher density zoning. But even before comprehensive zoning, most of the zoning was still single family zoning. There was not a lot of multifamily zoning, but that changed with each subsequent general development plan. And the next one, this is the 1978 plan, where you see the orange and darker red. So over here is Annapolis. This is western Anne Arundel County, and this is northern Anne Arundel County. That is where you see the higher density housing policies, or the higher density land use permitted. And then in these lighter sections is where you see low to low medium. At the time, low density zoning was 1 home per acre. Medium was 5 homes per acre, and anything above that was considered high density zoning. So you see these same patterns. This is the 1986 plan, same patterns. This over here is the 1997 plan, and then this is the 2010 land use map. This map over here on my right is the school zone map. And if you were to juxtapose this school zone map, what you would see is the Meade cluster, Meade High School, which serves this region of the county over here, is continues to be predominantly non-white. Whereas if you look at, say, the Severna Park feeder system, Severna Park is predominantly white, and you see the difference in land use and zoning that was permitted in these regions of the county. So I did use a few case studies to illustrate the point. The first case study that I discuss in chapter 4 is Parole Elementary. So Parole Elementary was a African-American school prior to desegregation. After 1954 and Brown versus Board of Education, it remained entirely African-American. No white students attended that school. It was desegregated under a freedom of choice basis prior to the requirement of geographic districting for schools. So in 1966, when health the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare required that Anne Arundel County desegregate on a geographic basis rather than a freedom of choice basis. The first plan had Parole Elementary with about 86% of their students African American, and about 16% of their students were white. And the subdivisions that surrounded Parole Elementary, most of them were predominantly African American, with the exception of 2 neighborhoods that were completely white. And what happened in this scenario is the parents of the white students who were zoned for Parole Elementary challenged the lines, and their argument was they didn't want their students in a school where their kids would be so on the what they perceived to be the wrong side of a racial imbalance. So they challenged the school district lines and took it to the State Board of Education, and the State Board of Education heard the case. They were very clear to say that they weren't hearing the case to evaluate the degree to which Anne Arundel County did or did not implement the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They were hearing the case because their role as a State Board of Education was to determine whether or not sound educational policy was taking place. Ultimately, they ruled in favor of the white families and ordered Anne Arundel County to redraw district lines around all of the Annapolis area schools to create a more racially balanced demographic profile. So this was a really important case, not just in Anne Arundel County, but throughout the state, because it provided districts with guidance of like what threshold would be deemed appropriate, what racial threshold would be deemed appropriate for desegregation. So the new lines, ultimately the state had to kind of step in and draw the lines for Anne Arundel County. And those new lines had about 44% of the student population at Parole as white and 56% as African American. Now, over time, the Parole area was one of the centers of development through the general development process. So throughout 1968, 1978, 1986, and beyond, that region of the county was considered a destination of development. So high density zoning was permitted in that region of the county. Today, if you look at the demographics of Parole, it's now called Mills Parole Elementary, named after Walter Mills, who I do mention in my paper was a principal and an activist in the 1930s. Mills Parole Elementary today is about 98% non-white. So a very, a new form of racial segregation emerged at Parole Elementary. Freetown Elementary, the story is a little different, but ultimately the ending is the same. So Freetown Elementary was also an African American school prior to desegregation. Freetown is a small region of northern Anne Arundel County where Pasadena and Glen Burnie meet. And it began as a community in the 1840s of freed African Americans. The land was purchased by a freed slave who then sold bits and pieces of the land off to other African American families. So it became like a vibrant historical African American community by the 1860s. And Freetown Elementary was built in the 1920s as a Rosenwald school. And then it was rebuilt in the 1959, got a new building under sort of the school consolidation process. So when Freetown was originally desegregated, it was also desegregated under a freedom of choice basis. And even though it was a new school building that could hold up to 300 students, it was an under-enrolled school because white families did not choose to send their children to Freetown Elementary. However, in 1966, when Anne Arundel County Public Schools was desegregated under a geographic plan, an addition was added that had a much higher capacity. And for a time, there was a significant white student population at Freetown Elementary. In 1960, when the doors opened, the 1966-67 school year, it was 18% African American. However, northern Anne Arundel County is a target of growth and development throughout the general development process. So as more and more high density zoning was permitted in that region of the county, some of that land got sold off to developers, and some public housing projects went into that region of the county. And ultimately, the demographics of the school shifted, and today it is predominantly non-white student population. The last case study I cover in my paper is Seven Oaks Elementary. So Seven Oaks was a community in Odenton in western Anne Arundel County, which was also a target for growth and development. However, the growth and development in western Anne Arundel County really didn't take off until the 80s and into the early 90s. So from the 1960s to the 1980s, Odenton was a very rural place, with the exception of the area right around Fort Meade. The land that was owned by families that wanted and tried to develop it over the years, but there just wasn't a lot of infrastructure in that region of the county. So it took a lot of sort of government coordination to get infrastructure like sewage and water and all of that stuff out to western Anne Arundel County. So Seven Oaks was built in the early 1990s, and it's what's called a planned unit development. It's a mixed-use development with single-family, multifamily, and townhomes. And from its inception, Seven Oaks was considered a upper middle class destination for African American families. And when it first opened, these children went to Odenton Elementary, Arundel Middle School, and Arundel High School. But population in western Anne Arundel County exploded in the early 90s, and schools quickly became kind of overwhelmed by the rapid growth in student population. So they had to redistrict the Odenton schools in order to accommodate this growth. So in the redistricting process from 1994 to 1995, district leaders wanted to move 7 students who lived in Seven Oaks from Odenton Elementary to Meade Heights Elementary, then to Meade Middle School and Meade High School. So the parents of students in Seven Oaks challenged that decision, and one of their arguments was that it would result in Meade becoming disproportionately and overwhelmingly African American, while Arundel High School would become predominantly and disproportionately white. And they felt like the district lines would create an unfair racial imbalance. So again, this went all the way up to the state Board of Education, and they heard the case, and they ruled in favor of the Seven Oaks parents, because not because of the racial imbalances. It was really because the move was not going to correct overcrowding at these various schools. So the county was ordered to redraw the lines to keep Seven Oaks kids in the Arundel feeder system. And 2 subsequent times, in the late 90s and then in the mid 2000s, the district again attempted to move Seven Oaks families from the Arundel feeder to the Meade feeder. And by 2008, they were successful. The last redistricting took place after Seven Oaks Elementary was built. So they had their own elementary school. And what the parents desired was that those students would go to Seven Oaks Elementary, Arundel Middle, and Arundel High School. But the district wanted to move them into the Meade feeder system. And ultimately, in that case, the State Board of Education ruled in favor of the district, and Seven Oaks students now attend the Meade feeder system. And if you look at the demographic patterns of Meade High School and Meade feeder system schools, they are overwhelmingly and predominantly non-white. It's an even mix of African-American students and Hispanic students today, but the density of zoning that is permitted in those neighborhoods is much higher than the density of zoning that is permitted around the Arundel feeder system. All right, so conclusions that I was able to draw from my research. One is that patterns of land use and zoning that were established prior to the comprehensive zoning process and the general development process were maintained throughout the second half of the 20th century. And ultimately, those patterns were amplified by government policy. So government policy around land use resulted in uneven distribution of residents throughout Anne Arundel County and left some communities that were kind of protected from development as predominantly and overwhelmingly white, while other communities transitioned into predominantly non-white, and their school demographic patterns reflect those community demographics. Another really important thing that I discovered was in every general development plan, there was real tension present between the need to accommodate a rapidly growing population and the desire to keep Anne Arundel County rural and agricultural and the same. Phrases like preserve the culture, preserve the nature of our county, from my view, became proxy language to protect specific communities from growth and development. And those are the specific communities that were ultimately remained predominantly white. Another broad conclusion that I can draw is woven throughout the general development plans was just an overall resistance to change. And often it appears as if the goals of environmental protection and the desire to, the goals of environmental protection and the desire to provide affordable housing to people in Anne Arundel County were often in conflict with each other. And it seemed that some communities got policy that protected them from growth and development, while other communities became targets of growth and development, and therefore their schools were more likely to be overcrowded, more likely to have students who were relying on federal assistance, and schools that tended to be lower performing than the schools in the communities that were predominantly and overwhelmingly white. All right, further research. So I think more work needs to be done to probe the relationship between environmental protection and continued patterns of segregation. It seems counterintuitive that these two goals would be in conflict with each other. But my research suggests that there's definitely a relationship and maybe an unintended consequence of policies around environmental protection has resulted in increased racial segregation. But my study didn't dig very deeply into that relationship. So I think more work needs to be done on that. Another area of research that I think could come out of this is the role of access to transportation in land use policies and zoning. I mean, one of the reasons why much of the development was pushed into Western and Northern Anne Arundel County is there was already infrastructure present in those regions. There were major roadways, there, like I said, access to sewer and water already existed. So there was a reluctance among county planners to make the kind of investment that would have been necessary to build infrastructure in other parts of the county, which would have allowed them to develop other regions of the county. So I think more research needs to be done about why that is and what role state policy had over those trends. My study very much focused on the policies. I did not dive very deeply into the people who developed these policies, but I do think it would be an interesting and important study to find out like who was in charge, what were their values, and how did their values shape the policies that they ultimately created. And then lastly, I think woven throughout my study is references to sort of the relationship or the intersectionality, I should say, between race and income level. But it was not probed very deeply in my study. So I do think more could be done to look at the relationship or the role of socioeconomic factors such as family, income, family status, and the relationship between race and human activity. Like how much of living patterns as a result of personal preferences. Why do people choose to buy a house in one neighborhood that costs, anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 more just for living in that particular neighborhood, where they could buy the same kind of house in a different part of the county for much less? Like, what's behind that choice? Certainly there is the perception that schools in those regions are better and more successful. So I think more needs to be done on people's attitudes and feelings about where they live and why they live there. Okay, that concludes my presentation.